Welcome to the PhD Science Experience. My name is Isaac Stoffer, and I'm a professional development manager here at PhD Science. Now, as a former teacher in a fourth grade co-taught classroom, what I loved about teaching PhD Science was how it supported all learners. Oftentimes, students who couldn't read and write above a first grade level were actually leading some of our fourth grade scientific discussions. And so that made me fall in love with the curriculum, and that's why I'm here today sharing it with you all. Now, to kick things off, I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to ask you to type your response into the chat. The question is, how can trees support so much life? And there are no right or wrong answers. Anything that you think as far as how trees can support so much life will be helpful. Oh, lots of things rolling in now. We have a good number of responses talking about oxygen. They provide oxygen. They also provide food and habitats for animals and people. They also cool people off in the shade, especially when it's very hot out. Yeah, all of those are definitely different ways that trees can support so much life. And we'll find out as we journey through our module whether the answers that we're thinking are correct or not. So let's dive right in. Now, in a moment, I'm going to show you an image, and I'm going to ask you to complete a notice and wonder routine. Now, a notice and wonder routine is when you look at the image, your brain is immediately going to start to think of things and see things in the picture. And those are things that you're going to think and record in the notice section of your handout. The wonder are going to be any questions that come to mind. You'll record those in the wonder section of your handout. And so we'll take about a minute to just observe the picture and do it independently. And then I'll ask for everybody to start to share their answers. Okay, I'm going to ask us to start first by sharing some of the things that we noticed. Go ahead and type into the chat, what are some of the things that you noticed about this image?
I'm seeing a bit more about the different colors. Participants are noticing that there are different shades of green and that there is quite a bit of brown, especially the leaves on the ground. Others are noticing that the tree trunk is not just brown, but actually has some green growing on it, with a couple sharing that that green stuff is called moss. We've got other noticing the wildlife like the rabbit. Perhaps there's even a snake crossing over the route. That's a little harder to tell. And some are calling out that the environment looks wet or damp because everything is so dark.
Beautiful. Let's go ahead and start to share some of the wonders that you had when you looked at this picture. Go ahead and type any wonder that you had into the chat. All right, we have a lot of questions coming in about the moss. How did the moss get there? Is it only on one side of the tree? Other questions about the tree itself. How old is it? With the colors that were noticed in the picture, we're wondering, why are the leaves different colors?
I'm seeing a question wondering where this is located, because this also seems like it could be a forest in upstate New York in the fall or autumn season, or perhaps it's in Flagstaff, Arizona at any time of year. So really, it just seems like it could be a forest anywhere.
Yeah, and you know what? I bet if we knew where it was located, that actually might help us answer some of the questions people are asking about the environment and what types of animals and plants are here and how they're kind of interacting with each other. Now we have a little more of a debate if it is a snake or if it is a rabbit in this picture. But what I'm noticing is a lot of people's notices and a lot of the questions that are coming through all are talking about the different plants and animals that you can see in this picture. Now, what I'm going to share with you is the word ecosystem. And an ecosystem is an interconnected system of living things in an environment, right? So how they interact with each other, why is the rabbit there? What does the rabbit have to do with the tree? Is the tree where the rabbit lives? Lots of things and the way they interconnect is what we call an ecosystem. And so we're going to try to explore this question here. What is a tree's role in an ecosystem? And to do that, I'm going to be reading from this great book I found at the library called The Mangrove Tree. And it's just going to help introduce us to more information about ecosystems. Now, I'm going to read a couple pages first, and all you have to do is just listen to start off with. Now, by the Red Sea in the African country of Eritrea lies a little village called Hargigo. The children play in the dust between houses made of cloth, tin cans, and flattened iron. The families used to be hungry, that their animals were hungry too. But then things began to change, all because of a tree. Now, the land in Hargigo is dry and dusty. There is very little rain. It was hard for leafy plants to grow, and the sheep and goats that eat leaves did not have enough food. Then a scientist had an idea to plant mangrove trees by the shore of the salty Red Sea so the animals could eat the fat green leaves of the trees. Just to check and see if you all were listening, does anybody want to either type in the chat or share out loud what was life like in Hargigo before the mangrove trees were planted? We do have some good listeners. Some thoughts coming through the chat here is that life was kind of dry and dusty, and there wasn't a lot of food. It was tough to live. It wasn't really the best situation. Now, I'm going to continue to read. And as I continue to read, what I'm going to ask you to do is find this page in your science logbook, Lesson 1, Activity Guide B. And now that you have this page pulled up, what you're going to do is anytime I mention a new organism in the text, you're going to sketch it, label it, record other information that you hear about it. And so we'll kind of have a little contest of who can come up with and record the most organisms. This is the tree, a mangrove tree. There are the trees, mangrove trees, that were planted by the sea. These are the seedlings that grew into trees, mangrove trees, that were planted by the sea. These are the women who tended the seedlings that grew into trees, mangrove trees, that were planted by the sea. These are the leaves, all plump and green, that wave in the trees that grew from the seedlings the women tended, a forest of trees, mangrove trees, that were planted by the sea. I also know that we're going kind of quick through this, so if your drawings are more sketches, that's absolutely okay. These are the goats, and these are the sheep that eat the leaves, all plump and green, that wave in the trees, that grew from the seedlings the women tended, a forest of trees, mangrove trees, that were planted by the sea. These are the shepherds who watch the goats and watch the sheep that eat the leaves, all plump and green, that wave in the trees, that grew from the seedlings the women tended, a forest of trees, mangrove trees, that were planted by the sea. Quick show of hands, virtually. Raise your hand if you have at least 4 organisms. We got some great listeners out there. Perfect. These are the children with dusty feet who play as the shepherds watch the goats and watch the sheep that eat the leaves, all plump and green, that wave in the trees that grew from the seedlings the women tended, a forest of trees, mangrove trees that were planted by the sea. And these are the fishermen who catch the fish that swim in the roots of the mangrove trees. Fathers of the children with dusty feet who play as the shepherds watch the goats and watch the sheep that eat the leaves, all plump and green, that wave in the trees that grew from the seedlings the women tended, a forest of trees, mangrove trees that were planted by the sea. Now, this is Gordon, whose greatest wish is to help all the fishermen catching their fish, to help all the children with the dusty feet, to help all the shepherds who watch the goats and sheep, to help all the women who tend the seedlings by planting trees, mangrove trees, by the sea. I do have just a little bit of additional text to read that might get you to add a couple more things to your list of organisms. Now, mangrove tree roots are hiding places for many sea creatures, such as small fish, crabs, shrimp, and oysters. Now, these small creatures attract bigger fish, and as a result, the local fishermen catch more and more fish for their families to eat and sell. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is to share out by typing in the chat at least one organism that you drew. And before you push send, you have to tell me what you showed that organism doing or how did it relate to the mangrove tree ecosystem. All right, we have some fish swimming among the roots, the seedlings that were planted to grow the trees. The sheep were eating the leaves of the mangrove tree, goats also eating leaves. Oh, wow, we have some great listeners out there. And not only did you hear about the different organisms, you're telling me about how those organisms are interacting, which is really helping us learn more about the ecosystem. Let's dive in a little deeper to these organisms that we're talking about and see if we can learn more about how all of them are interacting. So here is a list of all the organisms that I heard you all share in as part of the story. There may be a couple here that you missed or that I had or that you didn't have, and that's okay. What I want you to do is mentally choose two of the organisms shown on the screen and just jot down your two choices. And it's important you pick two, pick like a first one and a second one, because we're going to do something with these. And as soon as you have your two chosen, can you give me a virtual thumbs up? Almost all of us. Okay, great. Perfect.
In class, you do this as a link up routine, where students would meet with a partner to discuss their first choice organism and their partner's first choice organism and the interactions between the two, plus the connection of each organism to the mangrove tree, unless one of the organisms chosen by a partner was the mangrove tree. The second choice organism is a safety net in case both partners choose the same first choice organism. For today, though, you'll work independently using your notes to explore both organisms that you selected. You'll have a little over a minute to collect and jot down your thoughts. While you think and work on this, Isaac is going to share some additional information.
Link Up is an instructional routine that we use in our curriculum, and it encourages students to make connections between key terms and other important concepts that they are studying. So in this lesson, it's modified a little bit to focus on the relationships between organisms, but I've seen it also used to make connections between key terminology within those scientific concepts. If you're looking for more information about our link up routine or other instructional routines, you can find that in the instructional routines section of our implementation guide. There are a number of instructional routines that we utilize that support speaking, writing, reading, and other types of activities that just encourage collaborative conversations to really happen amongst the students.
And that implementation guide can be found in our teacher resource pack and accessed for free by adding it to your dashboard after creating a free Great Minds account. But now let's go ahead and share out via chat what your couple organisms were and the connections or relationship between the two and the mangrove tree. We've got some quick typists and overachievers here. So somebody chose to explore the relationship between the humans, sheep, and fish, with the fish and sheep providing food to the humans, and the tree providing nutrients to the sheep and protection to the fish. Another chose the goat, oyster, and small fish. The goat provides milk and clothing to the humans. The goat eats the leaves of the mangrove tree for sustenance. The small fish eats off the roots of the mangrove tree, and the small fish could be food for humans or large fish. And the oyster is similar to that of the small fish. Alrighty, and let's do that one more time. So pick two more organisms and figure out the connections between the two and the mangrove tree. We ideally will determine all the interactions between the organisms as a group through these link up routines.
just some more behind the scenes information about PhD science and this particular lesson. One of the things that we have embedded into almost all of our lessons is called a check for understanding. Now, these are little formative assessments that just help you know whether students are progressing towards demonstrating mastery of the standards that they're working to achieve. And in this particular check for understanding for this activity, I can see here, this is what I would see in the teacher edition, that I'm listening for students to describe how multiple organisms are involved in the interaction, and hopefully that their interactions that they're describing are related to food or shelter or resources or caring for other organisms. Now, a unique part about the check for understanding, in addition to it sharing the evidence that we are listening for in this case, is that it also gives me next steps that I can take for remediation for any students who are having difficulty describing the organisms and their interactions. If that were the case in this instance, I would take the guidance suggested and start to use some sentence frames. The blank organism and the other blank organism interact by blank. Sometimes our next steps in the checks for understanding are great ways to provide additional support for our EL students or other special populations.
Some of you already knew what was coming next, but if you haven't yet, go ahead and share out in the chat what your organisms were and the connections that you noted. I'm already seeing oysters, shrimp, and large fish. Oysters and shrimp eat the small particles of the roots of the mangrove tree, and the oysters and shrimp are food for the large fish. Also, the oysters and shrimp may act as filters in the water and help clean it. That's based on some prior knowledge that these folks have. Another chose crab, fish, and humans, and also interestingly noted about the filter concept. In addition to crab being food for the humans, the shells could even become a tool for the humans.
Beautiful connections. I noticed that what's been shared in both this one and the last, a lot of it has to do with what we heard about in the text. And people are even going a step further and bringing in their own real world experiences with some of these organisms and sharing some of the things they know or they think they know to help and move our discussion even further. Those are beautiful things to be seeing. What is interesting about all this is I'm going to pose a question and I'm going to ask everybody to type an answer in the chat. So we talked earlier about what life in Hargigo was like before the trees were planted. So go ahead and tell me in the chat, how did life in Hargigo change after the mangrove trees were planted? Human and animal life thrived. It was bountiful, sustainable food sources. Someone threw in our ecosystem where they said the ecosystem grew. What an interesting answer. There was a lot of living things depending on each other. And it just seemed overall better than it was before the mangrove tree arrived. More interconnectedness. Yeah, absolutely. What I'm going to challenge us to do next is show all the interconnectedness that we just talked about, but get it down on paper so we can see it, not just verbally talk about it. And so in your logbooks, there is a lesson 2 activity guide. And so we're going to use this space to model the interactions of the organisms that we all just talked about in the mangrove tree. And so I'm going to give you 2 to 3 minutes, I think, independently to draw or sketch to the best of your ability some of the interactions that we talked about. I've put the different organisms here on the left, so you have those for reference if you want to use those. You can also use your notes from the text, and you may consider using labels or arrows or other details to describe the interactions. So go ahead and take about 2 minutes at this time and draw your model. And I'll just reiterate that I know 2 minutes isn't the most amount of time to get your initial thoughts out. So instead of thinking about the word draw, if you're just sketching furiously, that's absolutely okay. There will be time later to definitely add more details. All right, so some additional behind the scenes information about what's going on here. Developing and using a model is something we do pretty frequently in PhD science. And when we go through that process of creating that model, we go through the process that you're seeing here, where we start independently with our initial model. And then we go to partners or small groups to compare models. And then the next step, which we haven't got to yet, but we will, is we will have a whole group discussion where we all get to share our ideas and create kind of a class-wide version of the model. Now, this process we use more than just with models. We use it actually with some of the investigations and other activities within the curriculum. But it's kind of unique in that it's a little different from the typical, like, I do, we do, you do process that many educators have been exposed to and utilized in their classroom. It's almost kind of flips that on its head with the students doing their part by themselves first. Now, this is very intentional on our end because it really allows the learning that's taking place to be student driven. It also allows students to share their ideas in a more safe way. So they get the time to resonate with their own thoughts and grapple with what to put down first. And then when they go to their compare step with partners or small group, they get to refine those ideas and discover and build knowledge and collaborate with their peers so that what maybe they weren't sure about, someone else has just now shed light on or allowed them to reaffirm an idea they had. So they're going through this refining process so that by the time we get to the whole group discussion, really the best ideas are what's coming out. And the teacher is mostly acting as a facilitator in the learning, right? They're helping to clarify things or address maybe some misconceptions that are coming up, but they're not really the ones telling about what's happening. They're getting that information from the students, right? They're not the holders of all the knowledge, disseminating it into students. Students are really saying, hey, you know what? Here's what I saw. Here's what I know. Here's what I think is true because of this evidence. And the teachers get to help expand on that and drive that learning home. When this process comes to life in the classroom, it really does represent a student-driven classroom and highlights a lot of different students' ideas so that more students have a voice and more students are really being stakeholders in their learning. Now, I'm going to switch my camera over to my document camera here.
Thinking more about what pairs of students are doing when they compare their models prior to the whole group creation of the anchor model, students should be noting similarities and differences. And as they note their differences, hopefully they're asking questions like, why did you add that to your model? Or what evidence do you have to support that idea? And based on peer responses, perhaps students will update their models based on those ideas and evidence shared so that we really do have the strongest, most evidence supported anchor model as it's created as a class.
So, what you've done now is you had your ideas individually, you've gotten to share them with your groups and find some similarities and between your models. And this time, now we're going to share out loud what are some of those similarities that we have between our models. And we're going to compile all of those ideas on a class-wide anchor model so we can hear the ideas of the different groups, which hopefully represent the ideas of everybody in that group. So it's like everybody's contributing to our class anchor model.
To share out loud today, go ahead and leverage that chat functionality once again so we can get our class model looking great and representing everybody's best thoughts. If you were doing this in a real classroom setting, you'd pause occasionally to check in with the class to make sure that everybody agrees with the organisms being added, where they're being placed, and on the connections between the organisms. Okay, it looks like we're ready to begin drawing our anchor model now. It seems that the majority began their drawings with the mangrove tree and placed it in the center of their paper with the tree roots in water. And the tree is taking up a big portion of the paper. And while Isaac continues drawing, making sure to get our tree roots in the water, I want to share that it's okay if our drawings or sketches don't look exactly alike, as long as we have similar ideas of what should be in the model. And Isaac, if you don't mind flipping your view so that we can see our anchor model a bit bigger for the mangrove tree, that'd be great. Moving on in our drawing, several put shrimp, crab, and oysters in the water, with most putting them near the roots of the mangrove tree. We've even got some guidance on how to draw that shrimp. It's a bit of a swirly cue, and if we label our sketches, then it's okay if our sketches are a bit rough because we're not all world-class artists, but we can all do art. And some are sharing more details about why they placed the shrimp, crab, and oysters near the roots of the tree. They made tiny organisms and particles off the roots of the tree. But interesting. I'm noting a bit of a disagreement about the oyster placement. Perhaps they should be on the roots and not just near the roots because they almost act as barnacles. And the story shared that oysters like rocks and hard surfaces. That's okay because we can note that and update it as we learn more. And just like we label our organisms, it's a best practice to title our anchor model too. So go ahead and take care of that. Moving on in our drawing once again, we've got a few sharing that they drew fishermen and that they were placed on the land but near the water. Additionally, a couple drew families, with one noting that the families around a picnic table. Those families are eating and enjoying the fish that the fishermen had catch. But something I'm seeing more consistently than fishermen is just humans more broadly coming up in the chat. And those humans were, yes, also placed on the land. And it's important to note too that the land or grass is placed above the water and not in the water. So now we're getting our land drawn and our humans, even if they're just stick figures. Again, we don't all have to be world-class artists, but we can all do art. And I'm seeing that we may want to draw some other organisms in the water, okay? Like our big and our small fish. And it's okay, again, if you don't have those or some of the other organisms or other thoughts on your individual anchor models, you can go ahead and update those now. We're also gonna, if we were in a real class setting, come back to our whole group anchor model and do updates as we learn more. Again, returning to our drawing of the land. Okay, so returning to land, goats and sheep should also be in our anchor model, perhaps near or simply intermingling with the humans. And now I think we're about ready to add on our interactions between the organisms. Okay, once we got our mangrove tree labeled there. To begin, several noted that the goats and sheep eat the leaves of the mangrove tree. Several also noted that the big fish eat the small fish, and the humans eat the big fish, while the small fish eat shrimp, oysters, and crabs. Some shared that the humans may eat the goats and sheep too, but even if they don't eat them, the humans can get wool from the sheep and milk from the goats. So there's a connection or relationship there. And quite a few are commenting that perhaps their arrows are going the wrong way so far, but that's okay. Mistakes happen and science can be a bit messy. And so we'll do our best to remedy that as we go. And in class, we could get it right on our update once we have even more information. But back to the model itself. The shrimp and oysters eat nutrients off the roots of the mangrove tree. Moving on with our anchor model from sketching to summarizing what is shown for a mangrove tree ecosystem. Chat us 1 to 3 sentences that explain the organisms and interactions. So, again, go ahead and chat us 1 to 3 sentences that explain the organisms and interactions in our mangrove tree ecosystem. I'll do my best to share much of what I'm seeing for folk sentences as Isaac considers what we should write as our whole group anchor model description. All right, so I'm seeing the organisms depend on each other. The trees created a link between many organisms. Even when it's not a direct link, the mangrove tree is practically like the center of their little universe. The mangrove tree provides habitat and food for many forms of life. There are several organisms and they're interconnected.
I want you all to give yourselves a round of applause. We just created an anchor model about the mangrove tree ecosystem, and look how much information is in our drawing. And this is just where we're starting. We're going to learn a lot more about it, and we're going to be able to update it as we learn more, maybe in some different colors to show how we're building knowledge. And then our explanation is going to get much longer as we learn more about the mangrove tree ecosystem. What I want you to do at this time, and this will be the last thing we do in our student hat, is to think of 1 or 2 lingering questions you still have about the mangrove tree ecosystem, or maybe it's about its connection to Hargigo. But those questions are going to come into play in just a moment. What questions do you have about the mangrove tree ecosystem or its connection to Hargigo?
Go ahead and start typing your lingering question or questions about our mangrove tree ecosystem into the chat, because we're going to be using those questions to build a driving question board. And we're going to capture all our questions in Padlet so that we're able to organize our questions by how closely related the questions are to one another. All right, Isaac, we've got our fast type it's here in the chat once again. This time I'll type some of the responses if you want to go ahead and type some of the others. And we can both rearrange the questions a bit by relationship to one another. So some of the questions I'll be writing are, where did the mangrove tree seeds come from? How did the humans know that the mangrove tree would improve their environment so much? What about water? Are there other water sources besides what the mangrove tree is growing in? Because it was noted earlier that the children's feet were dusty, so maybe it's a dry area. How did the humans know where to grow and cultivate the mangrove tree? Like in the water, which is different than many other plant species? Or conversely, how did they know it wouldn't harm or hurt their environment? Because we've got some prior knowledge about invasive species. Are there other mangrove trees or just the one? Did organisms come to Hargigo because of the mangrove tree, or were they already there?
Like, what exactly did the small sea animals eat from the mangrove tree? Like, I know we said roots, but are there parts of the roots, or because I think some of them are too small and too big. And that kind of goes a little bit, well, it's kind of this maybe a new category about eating. I saw a couple of other questions pop up in the chat, so if you see me adding them. What I do know is that all of these questions seem to center around one main big question. We're going to call this our essential question because it's kind of how all of them are connected. And it may be a question you've seen before, but it really begs to ask the question, how can trees support so much life? This will be our essential question, and we'll make it a different color so we can remember Everything we're trying to answer is going to help us answer this essential question: how can trees support so much life? And I see some of these clusters of questions coming together. And so this group on the left over here, kind of talks about how do plants grow? Now, I know not all the questions directly relate to that, but it seems that this kind of answering this larger question would help us answer a bunch of these smaller questions. And similarly, all these questions over here just have to kind of do with food for now. Maybe we'll be able to turn that into a question. And then we have these questions here in the middle, and all of those have to do with mangrove tree and hargigo. All right, why was it, oops, not a question mark, but why was it able to work so well there, but not as well other places? So great job, you guys. We captured all of our questions on this driving question board. We have our essential question: how can trees support so much life? And we're really going to try to spend some time looking at some of these other questions that are under here as we move throughout our module. Now, the last thing I'm going to ask you to do in your student hat is to think of some additional experiences that you have from your own life about what are other reasons that trees are important to humans and other organisms. You can type those answers in the chat. Yeah, they help clean the air.
Oh, okay. So some of our participants know that trees help filter out carbon dioxide, which helps clean the air.
Cool. Got a private message here about how trees provide homes to people. I think we said that earlier too. Homes and food, heating and cooling the house, shade and protection from the cold. Great idea. Yeah, and then here are just some other ideas that I've heard people say in the past. Firewood, building houses, making paper, things like that. Yeah, all these things that have to do with trees and why they're important, we call those related phenomena because they're connected to how trees can support so much life, which is the main thing we're trying to look at here. And they might help us answer some of those questions. Now you can go ahead and take off your student hat and put your teacher hat on for a moment. And there are just a couple of other pieces that I want to touch base with you on about this curriculum, including at the end, some questions and answers that have come through. Now, what we just experienced thus far is the development of some of the key features of our curriculum, which we call the anchor visuals. Now, you'll notice that we developed the anchor model and the driving question board here on the ends, and we didn't get to the third visual yet, the anchor chart. Now, these are all foundational components because they allow the curriculum to be student-driven and they serve as organizational tools. Right? Anything we investigate and any science that we learn, we're going to record those facts on the anchor chart, just general scientific knowledge that we build, right? Plant tissues formed with matter from air and water. Then we're going to see if it applies to explain our anchor model, right? Can this help explain some of the things that we're experiencing or seeing in the mangrove tree ecosystem? Maybe we can update our picture and our explanation with this knowledge. And then we're going to go back to our driving question board and say, hey, you know what? We've been able to answer these 4 questions. What questions should we investigate next? And because these items are updated frequently, we consider them to be kind of living documents. They're referred back to, students continue building their knowledge and growing them. Right? One example is that students design their own investigation to figure out which sources of matter between water, air, and soil contribute to plant growth. And through that investigation, they determine actually this update that you see here, that plant tissues are formed with matter from air and water. Here's what they look like when they're first developed, and here's what they look like at the end of the module. You can see how that knowledge is building. When we use these anchor visuals, it's important that students continue to have a voice in building these. They're student driven. It's also important that we keep working through that routine we talked about earlier, where students get a chance to do things independently first and then compare, revise, and refine with small groups and peers, and then finally contribute to a whole group discussion where the teacher is just a facilitator. Now, when we look at the teacher edition itself, we'll dive into some sample images from the lesson that we actually just experienced as a student. Now, each lesson has three important components. It has a launch, a learn, and a land. Now, the launch introduces students to the topic, where the next component, the learn, is where students do the majority of the learning of new material. And then it ends with the land section, which is usually the wrap up and sometimes a segue into the next lesson. Now, with the lessons, we do have a little agenda box up here in the top right corner that tells how the lesson is broken down and can offer some suggested pacing throughout the lesson. Since the learn section is where most of the learning happens and the majority of the lesson is spent here, it often has subsections that are helpful to note if you need to split the lesson up. Now, this was a lesson from our 3-5 curriculum, and so our 3-5 lessons are designed to be 45 minutes, while our K2 are designed to be 35 minutes. However, in both grade bands, there are about 25 to 30 lessons per module and 4 modules per grade level, which does mean that there are around 110 lessons per year. Now, this is great news because it means that there's a built-in customizable flexibility for teachers who may not have an opportunity to complete an entire lesson every day for whatever reason. Now, our teacher edition, you may have noticed, is really supportive of teachers because it features a sample classroom dialogue, right? This is not meant to be used as a script, but more as a guide so teachers know what types of questions to ask and what types of answers to be listening for to move the learning forward. Also, you'll notice on the right here, we have what we call just-in-time notes. Now, these are so supportive of teachers because they give teachers help in a number of different areas. Teacher notes about the lesson, the investigation, the resources, support for English language development students, other differentiation pieces for your lessons to support both high and low learners, content area connections to English and math, extensions, checks for understanding, little formative assessments, and spotlights on three-dimensional integration and other topics. Now, it supports teachers super well, but I imagine that you all still have some questions for how exactly the curriculum operates. And so I did get a couple of questions through the chat that I'm going to address in just one moment here.
We also have a list of some frequently asked questions that Isaac's going to address now. And if we don't address your question today, then we will follow up with you directly in the next couple of days.
So one of the questions that came through is, what does module planning look like? And so first I'll say that we do offer professional development called Launch PhD Science and module level study that support an introduction to the curriculum, and the module level study session can get you a replicable process that can be used to deepen your understanding of any module. Now, outside of those professional learning sessions, we do have some free resources available in the teacher resource pack, a pacing guide, a preparation guide that are available to assist you in module planning. Another question that came up is, what kind of language supports are there for my EL students? Now, you did see the just-in-time notes that have English language development support, but we also have an Appendix D with Spanish cognates if they're applicable, and we utilize a lot of different instructional routines that support collaborative conversations for all types of learners. The best way to support EL students, though, is through what we call our ABC CBT approach, where we give students exposure to an activity that helps them understand a scientific concept. And then once they have that exposure to the concept, we then CBT concept before terminology. Then we apply the terminology to it so that students can learn the terminology and concepts in a very authentic way, which helps with retention and application to other contexts. Another question that came through is, can I break this lesson apart and deliver it at different times during the day or the next day? And the answer is yes. Because of our flexible pacing of 110-ish lessons per school year, it allows for that to occur for any number of reasons why you may not have science every day or shortened science periods, or maybe students are just so engaged that their discussions are lasting a little long and you don't want to cut them off. That's absolutely okay. Can you combine it with your math or English lessons? And the answer is also yes. Our curriculum utilizes a core text in every module, which is one of a unique feature of ours. And so that allows for cross-curricular connections to ELA, which can assist in improving pacing. Similarly, as many of the science and engineering practices, some of them relate to math. And so there are opportunities for cross-curricular connections in that content area also. How much prep time do I need prior to teaching is asked a lot. And so, just in being honest, it is science. So, there is some prep that needs to go into it. And it's hard to say a specific time slot because each lesson is a little different. There are some lessons where you have no prep really, and then there are some where you're just making sure you're planting some seeds. So, there are three different places, though, that can cue you into what preparation is needed for the different lessons. Two are woven directly into the teacher edition itself, and one is our free preparation guide as part of our teacher resource pack that more extensively supports the preparation. We're often asked how NGSS is woven into the lessons. And so I'll tell you straight up that PhD science was built for the NGSS, right? We didn't retrofit anything in existence to meet the new standards. We built it from the ground up. And so because NGSS is based on the framework for K-12 science education, you'll find integration of the three dimensions, the science and engineering practices, the cross-cutting concepts, the disciplinary core ideas occurring in concert with each other for maximum comprehension. You might be wondering, what if my state is not an NGSS state? Is it easy to kind of figure out how the modules fit together to meet our standards? And the answer to that is it's okay if your state is not an NGSS state. Our team has done state alignment studies on all the states to determine the best path forward for non-NGSS states. And finally, how do your digital and print or hands-on materials work together, or do they work separately? And I'll say that there really is no replacement for hands-on learning. We have created PhD Science in Sync to support building science knowledge in a remote environment. Now, PhD Science in Sync is not meant to replace the core curriculum and operate as a separate tool, but really it's been designed to complement it, to ensure that students are seamlessly integrated into the learning as much as possible. Thank you so much for joining us in the PhD Science experience today. Thank you.